absolutely acknowledge that terrible, terrible things have been done to the Aboriginal community in Australia. We absolutely acknowledge that there are systematic disadvantage that continues to trouble this part of our nation. But we don't think the way to resolve that problem is to try to reconstruct an Australia that has not existed for 200 years and in fact was never a nation to begin with. We think furthermore, the answer to that problem is not to tell Aboriginal people in Australia that either you are Aboriginal or you are Australian and that there is no ability to reconcile an Aboriginal identity with an Australian identity. To say to them that you have to choose whether you are Aboriginal or whether you want to make Aboriginality only a part or a small sector of your overall identity. So I'm going to be dealing with in rebuttal, first of all, the best way to fight the systematic poverty facing Aboriginal people. Second of all, this idea of like how best to compensate them. And then third of all, Aboriginal identity, and that leads into my substantive. So first of all, to this idea about how best to fight the poverty that faces the Aboriginal community. So what Dan and Steph told us was that because Aboriginal people have no choice over the style of government, they are always going to be dictated to, they're always going to be a minority, and that those policies are not going to suit them. We think that the way our modern pluralist democracy is constructed is to preserve the rights of minorities. We think that, like, in modern Australia, more than 40% of our population is born overseas. We think that those same claims are available to everyone. Our society is founded on the process that, like, you have cultural freedom insofar as it doesn't infringe on other people's individual rights, but also that the state must actively preserve your rights, including political and economic rights. We think it's really important that you have strong state infrastructure that has the ability to preserve those rights. If, for example, if children are very poor, to give them that money, to give them scholarships, to get them through school, to ensure that those opportunities are open to them. We think that, as Sarah told you, those opportunities are very problematic under a model where we just set them loose and place them in the desert in the Northern Territory. Second of all, we heard this idea, okay, so they told us that, like, we will give them aid, it will be fine. And like we're going to keep giving them aid because we don't want a crisis there. We think, first of all, that totally undermines your narrative of self-determination, right? Of this idea of like standing on your own 2 feet and like doing it Aboriginal style. We think secondly, it means that this community or this nation is utterly tied to Australia. It means that Australia can still set policies and dictate terms because it's funding the operation. They said that, like, furthermore, that in the long term that they'd be able to build up, the economic infrastructure, it'd be fine. We told you that, like, when you are talking about this incredibly poor, disadvantaged community, which you have acknowledged and set up as the problem in this debate, that there isn't that kind of knowledge basis, that there isn't that kind of infrastructure and institutions existing amongst that population to run a state, right? We think, like, in order to preserve the fundamental economic and political rights of people, you need to have a state that has a large tax basis, that has industries that are, like, sustainable and can sustain a population. We think the Northern Territory is currently dependent on federal aid because they're not big enough as a state to support themselves. We think, furthermore, that when you, like, try and construct a new government from scratch with very little expertise in, like, bureaucracy, in managing systems and so on, and, like, accountability and so on, you don't have any of those institutions, you don't preserve people's rights and look after them in the best way. Furthermore, to this idea of, like, legitimacy as a nation, or, like, what is the best way to compensate the Aboriginal people. So they told us, like, this is the only way to compensate for white colonisation. We think that obviously there are other ways to compensate, right? We think there are, like, other policies that we can deal with this problem. We think that, like, we accept that there should be land rights given to Indigenous communities where there is an unbroken connection with the land, where that land is meaningful, where they are, like, have been there for generations. We think that like, but for the rest of Aboriginals, we think that that is not necessarily a meaningful policy that applies to them. We think that if you are an Aboriginal that lives in Sydney and does not want to, like, lives a reasonably, like, integrated, non-traditional lifestyle, you don't necessarily want to go and live in Northern Territory in the rural bush and have to live that kind of lifestyle. We think that you are also entitled to compensation, and we think that the best way to compensate you is to ensure that you have equal access to the same rights as everyone else does. We think that the state best does that when they remain part of Australia. moving on to this idea of Aboriginal identity. So they told us it's like the narrative of applying to the oppressor. We think, no, as we already told you, we are appealing to the diverse principles on which we base our society, that they are modern citizens who are claiming equal rights and saying, we are exactly the same as you, we have the same common interests, we are part of a nation and a society together. We don't think that that is like, humbling yourself before the oppressor. Furthermore, we don't think there is this binary between white people and Aboriginal people. We think there's an incredible mixture of like identities. We think that most Aboriginal people these days are mixed blood and have like a part of the modern Australian society that partake in the media and like talk to people that are non-Aboriginal and are part of that culture. We think that they don't see it as like this binary of white and black. They see themselves as being part of a modern pluralist society. Furthermore, they said that because they can't access important cultural rights like justice, circle justice, or Aboriginal justice with spearing or whatever. We think that first of all, that our society, that was pretty much the example that they used. We think that so first of all, we think that we permit access to cultural rights insofar as they don't access on the rights of individuals. We think if they want to access cultural rights like gatherings or meetings or religious ceremonies, they entirely have the ability to do that. We think that the only times that we don't allow that is when it is actively infringing on the ability of others, as to forced arranged marriages, for example, or something like that. We think, moreover, that the idea that, and the reason why we protect those things is because that was a form of justice that lived thousands of years ago. We don't think that it's relevant to the majority of modern Aboriginal Australians. We think that, moreover, what your model does is it empowers elites within these communities that currently have the power within these communities, and that's the only institutions of power that currently exist. So that is likely to be replicated in any kind of Northern Territory nation. We don't think that that empowers actors like women and less powerful minority actors within Aboriginal communities. And furthermore, that you don't then have those institutional capacity to ensure that the government in that state is actively reflecting their views and protecting them. And moreover, that those who want to access those cultural rights but don't want to live in Queensland lose out under your model because they either have to opt in or out of Aboriginal identity, essentially, by moving to the Northern Territory or remaining in the rest of Australia. We think that you are removing the cultural resources, moreover, that they might access living in the western suburbs in Sydney, because all of the education in schools for Aboriginal people and all of those services that the government currently provides, because they acknowledge that Aboriginal identity is an important one within mainstream Australia, is shifted to the Northern Territory. And we think that that is a bad thing for those that don't wish to solely identify with Aboriginal identity, that might wish to access that, but on a more pluralist, fluid level. We think, moving on to my substantive. Okay, so why does this limit Aboriginal identity? We think that first of all, in terms of lifestyle, we think that a lot of people might want to access this Aboriginal, notion of sovereignty and so on, but not want to have to move to the Northern Territory and all that entails in terms of lifestyle, living in the rural desert or whatever, and moving away from their friends and the family. But even if they don't want to make that choice, we think it removes their ability to access a meaningful identity that is good for them. We think it enforces the idea that you have to choose between being Aboriginal or Australian, and that you can't choose alternative methods of being Aboriginal. We think that it sends the message that white people and Aboriginals are so irreconcilable that they cannot exist within a common community. And because this reinforces stereotypes, we are very proud to